So namaste to everyone. So I'm just so honored to be here with everyone. You just pointed out just now, I was, working in the corporate world for a long time as a data analyst. And then we saw around 2018, 2019 in USA that there was constant attack on the Indian American community and also on blemishing the name of India, whether it was through anti-CAA resolutions, whether it was through farm law protests, or this caste issue. Kashmir, of course, is always there in the background. So when the caste issue came up, it was just unbelievable. I was personally involved in a multi-faith dialogue, interfaith dialogue, group, in which a lot of these Sikh professors who were Khalistanis used to always bring up caste. And this was in 2016, 2017, that Hindus are about caste, and Sikhism and all these other religions don't practice caste, and they used to create a lot of animosity against us as Hindus. And that is when I started researching about what is this whole, caste issue, and creating a lot of dialogue there. And then, of course, we were hit with resolutions against us in campuses, in corporates, all related to caste, with a fake survey called the Equality Lab survey that had a very unscientific basis of saying that there's a lot of caste-based violence and discrimination in the United States. As a result, we started doing a lot of advocacy work. And like I said, I'm humbled to be talking to academics who have spent so much time researching on various topics, because I recently started working in the academic framework on caste and Indian ethnology, because I felt like what we need is to go in depth. As activists, we just talk to talking points, very quick study issues. But to really dissolve caste consciousness, to really understand it, we need to understand how this came about, what is the real meaning of the term. And we always keep saying in the United States that caste is not varna and caste is not jati, and they don't conflate. But then what is the framework? How do we defend ourselves? So that is the whole purpose of this hopefully short and sweet talk. I want to make it as interactive as possible, so please don't hesitate to interrupt me if needed. Because my personal understanding is that caste was a completely colonial invention of blood purity. And the sort of brief points that I'll be covering is that caste was a word and race was a word that did not exist before, say, 1492, when the papal bull was issued by the Pope, saying that you are the supreme white race, go and conquer the world. That is when the word race started to make its way into the vocabulary. And caste was a word that was born wherever these supremacist white people went to colonize, and then they had biracial births, with the locals. And it was a very systematic blood purity concept, where if you're white, you're supreme, and if you're black, you are the lowest. And anything in between also had nomenclature. So the labeling was clear. And this is a system that is based on blood purity, and as we go along, I'll talk about it, that it never existed in India. So the term caste has to go away. That is the only way, and that is why my first slide said caste is the N word. Just like in USA, the Negro word is banned because it's supposed to be a slur. It is a bad word. So nobody says it. If you say it, you can get treated as a criminal. Also, have to pay a penalty, things like that. So caste in itself is also a concept based on hierarchy, as we will see. Marriage, because it is based on biracial births, caste in reality has a lot to do with marriage and how endogamy, exogamy, or hypergamy, etc. play out. So that is briefly something that I will talk about. I will also talk about how the caste census played a very big role in, whether in USA, whether in India during the British times, how it created the whole ethnographic state, as Nicholas Dirks calls it, to create the castes of mind. That's the title of his book, Castes of Mind, and I think that is a very important thesis on this topic. So it is something that is embedded in our minds. Caste as a concept has become our vocabulary. A lot of the terminologies born during British times have become part of daily talk and even the constitution in India. So it is very hard for us to fight it in America unless we dissolve it globally, and specifically in India, where they have implanted it, embedded it so strongly during the British times and afterwards. And the last important thing which I feel most interesting for everyone should be how one AI-based analysis. So having worked in the field of data analysis and artificial intelligence, I use some of those skills to analyze a conference called Dismantling Global Hindutva. If anybody has heard about it, if you haven't heard about it, maybe I'll talk a bit about it. But when I analyzed what were they talking about, what is Hindutva? Because a lot of us don't know the meaning of Hindutva, and there are multiple meanings and definitions of the term. I wanted to know, what do the opponents think about Hindutva? What is their terminology? So that is something I will touch upon briefly when I talk about it. Now, we know that after 1492, that was a very racial time. It was clearly a racial time, and a lot of the studies that they developed, anthropology, ethnology, and anthropometrics, or even archaeology for that matter, everything was touched by the racial theories. And I'm just taking a look at some of the key issues that used to play out on a day-to-day basis in those days, in those centuries. Like in 12th century, the concept of blood libel began in, say, the Spanish territory, like the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. And that is the time when they were fighting the Islamic Jihad in those areas, and the Catholics were very successful in pushing them out. But at that time, the concept of blood purity really grew very strong, because they started to convert people to Christianity, and the Jews converted sort of en masse, but then they wanted to keep the Jews out of power. So anybody who had Jewish blood in them was considered impure blood. And that is where the concept of impure blood began, which led all the way to the Holocaust. So after the World War II, a lot of these theories were just closed down. In the UN, it was clearly like banned, and nobody in academia, everywhere. It became a banned topic. So nobody talks about those inquisitions that happened, the Catholic inquisitions that happened we just hear about Hitler. So it's a very, very clever criminal, always has an alibi or puts the blame on one individual or someone, right? And that is what they have done. Nobody thinks about the inquisitions when they think of caste or blood impurity concepts. All they think about is the German Holocaust of the Jews. But it began much earlier during the Catholic inquisitions and conversions in Spain. That concept, of course, carried on, like I said, during the papal bull, race, caste, blood purity, Hamitic hypotheses. All of these concepts have slowly died down. Caste, nobody talks of system of the castas, which went all over Americas, all over Philippines. Nobody talks about it now. But Aryan Dravidian theory continues to live. It is very similar to the Hamitic hypothesis. Hamitic hypothesis was established in Africa, that any knowledge system there which was good was brought by the Caucasians. Very similar to the Aryan theory. But I don't know how many people here have heard. I know you all are academics, so maybe you have heard about it. But most people haven't heard of the Hamitic hypothesis. Phrenology, the concept that a bigger your cranium, like the whites have a bigger cranium, so they are superior. You know, J.C. Bose, I think was one of the people who faced that discrimination. His salary as a scientist was lower than the white scientist because even though he was doing much, advanced work, but phrenology and cranium size based, discrimination has stopped. All these theories nobody talks about now. Criminal Tribes Act. Have you all heard of the Criminal Tribes Act? Okay, Criminal Tribes Act was something that actually was established in India. So a lot of these jatis and groups that used to rebel were warriors in India. In 1871, the British established a law called the Criminal Tribes Act. And a lot of our warrior jatis were banned, hunted down, killed. At birth, they were called criminals. They had to report regularly if they were alive at the local police thana on a regular basis. Some had to even sleep there and then, were hunted down or at least monitored regularly. So those are the kind of hard times that existed during the racial times. And only caste and Aryan theory really stay on, and we need to just dismantle this, especially the Aryan theory, which is so similar to Hamitic hypothesis. We are trying to establish a lot of like genetics and archaeological evidences and many other ways of dismantling it. And I think it's more or less now a done deal, but it's still seen in academia. So quickly, I want to take us through the next concept, just quickly to go through what kind of, really, if you've never seen System of the Castas, because caste is really, the word is chaste. Caste is purity, right? So it is the same blood purity concept. So this is how they used to really classify. And every place they went to, the Spanish or the Portuguese, they classified people based on how they were, how pure their blood was, where the nobles and the whites had the purest blood. So, they had peninsulares, criollos, were Spaniards born in the Americas, mestizos who had European plus Native American sort of mixed blood, castidos, so they were 3/4 Spanish and 1/4 American Indians, mulattoes who were then mixed European and African. So that came 5th, right? As you can see, the brown plus white is higher. So this is the color coding that used to happen in caste. So I'm just talking about this a lot because we have to always try to see, is that something we've ever seen in India? I don't think we've ever seen color coding. That is something that the British used to always find very strange, that there are people of all different colors in India. So they used to say Chinese, we can see and recognize, this, but Indians are of different colors. And my grandma was from Haryana, and she used to always tell us this joke, that one white man came and he said, यहाँ पे सब अलग-अलग कलर के कैसे हो आप लोग, so she said हमारे यहाँ घोड़े तो सब अलग-अलग कलर के ही होते हैं, सिर्फ गधे हैं जो सफ़ेद होते हैं. So this is, I'm sure there was some pent up sort of, like these kind of jokes and cracking of, against the whites, because obviously they were oppressing our people so much, at that time. So one important thing that, have you heard of the book called, by Isabel Wilkerson, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent? Anyone? This, yeah, of course, anyone who's from US or has, touched the shores of US, it's a very, very, it has become a book that was promoted a lot by Oprah Winfrey, New York Times bestseller list. And now caste has become a household name in the word in the United States. Earlier it was like race, but she has equated caste with race, and she has said America and India had similar concepts, just like Nazi Germany. And so she says caste is the origin of our discontent. And the very famous quote from her is that race is the skin and caste is the bones. And as I'm saying here again and again, caste is not the bones. It is not the foundational element of, it is a derivative of race. Caste is actually the blood purity. So that is something that I'm adding to my book, as we go along. I'll be, there'll be a book that'll come out eventually, I think, on this topic. So marriage, like I said, marriage is a very important part, as we just saw. And you will see the technical detail they go into when they talk about how much blood is pure and how much is impure. So they had this whole concept of hypergamy. Why hypergamy? Because the idea was to convert the entire population to as white as possible. So people were encouraged to marry someone at a higher level than them, right? So the idea is that because they had embedded legal privileges within, so if you are a white person, a castizo, a mestizo versus a mulatto, you will have more privileges as you go higher up. So people liked that concept, and there was a lot of hypergamy. That is why if you go to the South Americas, you will see that a lot of people are very white there. You will never be able to tell that they have any native blood. And so this is just a quote I took from one of the visitors to colonial Mexico. And he says that, mixed blood in the offspring of a Spaniard and Indian, the stigma of race disappears at the third step, right? As the Spaniard and an Indian produce a mestizo and a Spaniard will produce a castizo and a Spaniard will have 7/8 blood Spanish, so now he becomes a Spaniard. So he's now at level 2, at least 2 he can reach. Nobody can reach 1 because those are the nobles who came from Spain. So that is the level of hierarchical discrimination, and all based on color and blood. So this is what caste really is, right? And we are just told, okay, this is what caste is, Brahmanism, casteism, all that in India, which is actually very different from what caste really means. So in short, just as we discussed, race, the color of the skin, blood, which is caste, and religion. As soon as people converted to Christianity, they got more benefits. So that is how they established the legal privileges and encouraged hypergamy, encouraged conversion, and this is actual oppression, right? If you don't convert, you can be killed or you can be treated as an impure person. That is what caste really means, right? And actually if you think of these colonial concepts, they played out in the Bangladesh war in some ways because the Pakistanis had bought into this concept so much, considering themselves as a martial race. And I do go in a little bit if we have time. So how much time do we have for this, Sampananji? 1 o'clock is fine. Yeah, that's a lot of time. So that I have sort of developed a hierarchical model as to what was the real caste system. They always blame it on the Brahmins, but was that really the truth during the British times? So some insight into that. And I'm very open to feedback, so please go ahead and ask me questions or raise some counterpoints. So now that I've said, racial, blood purity, and conversions to Christianity gave you higher rights, that is caste system. What was our Jati organization? And this is based on my study of what the colonialists looked at and how they recorded. So of course there was the most racist was Risley, who measured the nose and the cranium and color of the skin and classified our people into different categories. But most people said the basic social organization of Indians, Nesfield and Sennart and Ibbetson and a lot of these other social scientists said it is the Jati which is the core. Varna, nobody really knows the terms Shudra or Vaishya in most parts of, I think in Odisha and Bengal and all, those words are not even known when they went to study it, So these were the 5 sort of key aspects of a Jati. One is, yes, there was endogamous marriage, but that is why endogamy as you can see, is much better than hypergamy. Anyone wants to venture why? Because hypergamy is a basis of climbing up a social ladder because you are at a lower level, right? Whereas these people wanted to preserve their traditions in endogamy and marry within, keep their traditions intact, keep their social norms intact, worshipping traditions. So that is why, because they never saw themselves as inferior to the other party. So that endogamy, I think, is a sign that we had a very egalitarian model. I mean, a lot of our social engineering happened during the colonial times as well as, and both the colonial times, including the Islamic invasions and what, but I think the answer to your question is really in the first thing that you said, that they were kidnapped because they were considered to be more knowledgeable and higher because of that. And ours, because of the kind of respect we have for knowledge. I think that has always been a very important part. Isn't that what you said in the beginning? Like, or did I misunderstand?
I was saying that hypergamy is embedded in a very subtle way.
In a subtle way. I mean, yeah, social climbing, I guess, is a norm, is such. Yeah. But endogamy, to have that still, despite the fact that social climbing is so important to everybody, yet endogamy remained an important feature of our culture. And it still does to some extent. There's a lot of, the idea to be rooted in your traditions, in your culture, it remains an important part. And like I said, they want to keep their occupations alive. I guess now it's open because, we still don't have that, now we don't have that sort of connect to any one traditional occupational scheme, which you might have in a business family or something. But some features that I think were very common was the fact, and it has now been called as untouchability, right? But the term they use is commensality in the old colonial records. Commensality basically meant that they would eat and drink only from their own family or jatis, I think in rural India it still remains that they will not partake of each other's water, or you have to take permission before touching and all that. So that remains, either it is because of some hostilities or social dynamics of some sort, but that term that they used was commensality, like breaking bread with each other. Commensality would literally translate as that. So they would not eat with, others, like they would prefer to eat with their. So this is something I'm taking from colonial observations. A lot may have changed and a lot may have been, but there was this system there. Their settlements would be based in a particular village, setting. But I've heard that every village would have a mochi, every village would have, so there was a certain structure around it. But common settlements of one particular jati in one kumhars in one village, or like that was very common those days. But these were sort of the jati organizations, which, as you can see, has nothing to do with what should be called as caste, right? And they had, of course, common, like, the Vishwakarma or some other, deity would be common to that particular jati. And that is how they had common themes within their So the last thing is that caste is a misnomer for what kind of structure we really have in India. So we need to dismantle that term, is what I think is the most important thing, because it was embedded in our society using the census. So, so one of the important things I think I realized through my study is that the census is not a sterile exercise. It always has politics embedded in it. I mean, everybody must have heard of the Bihar census recently, right? The caste census demands that are happening. Why is that happening? Because the whole trend here is that the caste calculus has broken. And in, just ignore this. I think I put this, it is meant for the next slide. But in USA also, the blood purity concept was so strong because obviously there were Europeans who moved there. And they had the same sort of census phenomenon as any Spanish group would have. So the Europeans all had practiced this blood purity concept. And so they had even the one drop rule, I think, is very famous. One drop rule basically means that even if there's a single blood drop of a black person in say in me or someone, they will be classified as a black person in the census. So the census itself shows the kind of racial segregation that was practiced, or the kind of way they look down on race, on these races. They always try to measure how many were native Indians, how many of them were mixed blood, how many were full-blooded, because they wanted to decimate the full-blooded, right? So until the population went down to at least 20, 25% or less, and now I think it's even in single digits, Native American population has become mixed. They don't have those full-blooded tribal roots. I think that is one of the main things I was just discussing, that they want to forget our roots. And that is something that the colonial or neo-colonial, post-colonial systems have continued that don't go back to your civilizational roots. And India being the only civilization that is not in the museums, is a big threat to these forces who want to keep the colonial world order. So people always ask me, why would they want to gun after India just for no reason? But India is a big threat to all colonial, and today the way our civilizational ethos is rising, the renaissance that's happening here, I think that is one of the very big reasons that India continues to face charges abroad, and we are continuing to do our advocacy work. But one important thing here is that Hindu was also considered in the census as a nationality. So whether a Muslim, Sikh, anybody who went to US was considered as a Hindu. So using the same, concept that it is not a sterile exercise, one of the important things that I noticed in the census data of the British India was that, of course, they were classifying people, trying to understand their basic, merits and demerits and how they could divide and rule. But they had no recognition of a middle class. And this is something noted by other anthropologists also lately. C.J. Fuller wrote that in a paper that it's appalling, given that India was the richest country of the time, one of the top two, like China and India used to compete, that there is no mention of a middle class there in the census and no classifications based on that. So before I go into this, so I added some slides from a conference that I mentioned just now, the Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference. So how many have read the book or heard of the book Breaking India by Rajiv Malhotra, right? I think, oh yeah. His books have influenced a lot of us, and at least it has enriched a lot of us. And I was doing this analysis using some of the AI-based softwares. I was analyzing the content of this particular conference as to what are they discussing, how are they, so everything that they were discussing was around Breaking India. It was a case study, and I'm going to write this as a case study of Breaking India. Actually, I've spoken to Rajiv Malhotra ji also about it, that this will actually be a very good case study of how Breaking India forces plan, connive, and talk. And today, I think, if I may just be a little political and say, some of the quotes by Stalin and Rahul Gandhi are all around this conference. If you go read what's in the content of transcripts of these conferences, their demands for either the census or that Hinduism should die, dismantling it, everything is part of this conference, right? Asking for the caste census was discussed very seriously during this conference. They wanted to break out Adivasi as a separate category, as a separate religious code for animism. So I want to go back to the point that census is not a sterile exercise, and luckily we have a strong disposition in the center, which is why they are not like buying into these sort of theories. But They want separate courts so that they can divide and conquer votes, right? So that is the whole idea. Again, the term Adivasi is very important to them. They would not like to use the term Vanavasi because Adivasi ties into the Aryan theory, right? That Aryans invaded and then the indigenous people. Whereas I think the RSS uses the word Vanavasi, which is like really antagonizes them a lot because they are teaching the Adivasis to worship Ravan, not Ram. And sometimes they buy those concepts, right? And then they are teaching them to worship Mahishasur, that Mahishasur was a Dalit and Durga was the white lady. And this is a theory being proposed in, and articles are written in US all over. Like there's lots of discussions around this in academia and in media also. Obviously, they are trying to break apart Northeast because Northeast is now solidifying so much more into the civilizational. So there were quotes about that. So this is a whole sort of a, like I said, case study of breaking India. And when I did the analysis, one of the main things that came out of it was that it was a political conference. And the next important topic, there were two most important topics. One was politics and one was caste. So dismantling Hindutva to them included changing the party that exists at the center, and that was discussed a lot with Congress at the center of it, and caste being the tool. That is why there are demands for the caste census these days. Bihar already did it, and they are trying to implement the southern model of almost 60-70% reservations. So that is all coming from these kind of academic theories. So academia for us is so important. The fact that Rishihood is here and can influence everything in the West starts at the academia for 5-6 years. It incubates there and then goes into media, then into polity, institutionalized. And that is exactly how they work. So that's why the 2021 conference, which coincidentally happened on 9/11, the day the Twin Towers fell, on the anniversary of the Twin Towers, was just a very important sort of conference, which is why I felt the need to analyze it. And one of the important points that came out of it was this, the Brahmin at the root of all evil was playing out throughout the conference. When they attack Brahminism, Hindutva, they're also attacking Hinduism, So this was exactly how the conference played out. And I think this is a question I think people have to answer. So this is a little interactive. I just want to understand if anyone here can tell me which of these words are from our Indic scriptures or from our local terminology. Any word here that you recognize as Indian or none of them, right? None of these words are actually, which is actually, I don't know if you've heard of Salvatore Babanese. He wrote a paper about caste in USA. And he said Dalit is a religious word, So it is a Hindu religious word and things like that. So we did have a discussion on it and he said, no, it is. He refused to accept it. But the fact is these are not Indic words. These are all terms. And the label is the worst, as they say, the worst thing that a bully can ascribe to you. Because once you are stuck with an identity, you are then stuck with it, and that's what's happened to us. These Dalit and Adivasi are terms used by everybody. There's a need to sort of dismantle these terminologies because they were created with the whole idea of building that atrocity literature, defining us. And I want to sort of talk about that as to how some of these were created, right? So they have created the perfect criminal in the Brahmin, right? Everything is about anti-Brahminism, as I just mentioned in the previous chart. But what were the Brahmins known for? They were known for knowledge, like you just said. They were even kidnapped for their knowledge, looks like. But whatever it was, scholarship, knowledge, tap and tyag were our key, defining features of our civilization. So the reverence for the Brahmin was because they gave up, material wealth for the sake of scholarship. And it was not because they were controlling or they were, so the creation of the Dalits, the Adivasis, the scheduled castes, tribes, all happened during the British time, because think about it, in the next chart is Angus-Madison graph, right? The Angus-Madison graph is very famous because everybody thought for a long time that, okay, the Western world is so smart, they invented everything, and of course that is why the third world is the third world, right? But in reality, obviously, India was one of the richest countries. China was also a rich country. And where was all the wealth rested? It was rested in the broad middle class of the country, the thriving population that used to produce, the producers, the traders, the merchants. They were the people who had all the wealth. And that wealth, as you can see the graph, the dotted line is Britain. It was at the bottom when it first came to India, right? And then slowly their wealth rose as they built the extraction economy. And then India's wealth kept coming down, and there's that intersection point, right, around 1870, between 1870 and 1913. There was the maximum sort of, transition of wealth. And that's when, you just see India dipping down. And I just have 2 more slides, but I want to go through the points as to how the British really impoverished India and created these sort of groups, right? The Dravidians, to talk about anti-Brahmins, to the Dalit, the Adivasis, the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. How did this depressed class become a reality from the rich people that we had, who any rich country, if anyone here is an economics major or professor, you will see that, a great middle class is important to any rich country. A rich country cannot exist with lots of rich people and then poor people, it'll collapse. So the great middle class is what they impoverished through their extraction economy, through the Criminal Tribes Act, which I just mentioned earlier, the high taxation of around 80% plus, and man-made famines where over 1 million, plus people have died during those times when the population was not that high. Due to man-made famines in the villages, people died. I have done a study on that also, on some of the famines that occurred. And de-weaponization was an important part of their program, right? So they completely decimated all the wealth and the pride that the Indians had, and then they put all these labels on us, and that is how we became, the colonized. And that is why Dirks calls it the castes of mind. That book, nowhere in the book does he really explain that, why he's labeled the book Castes of Mind or titled that. But then when I was preparing this presentation, I just thought, that's what it really means. It's something that our minds have been colonized. And when I was analyzing the dismantling global Hindutva, I understood the definition of what Hindutva means to the opponents of Hindutva. So for them, of course, when political power in the hands of Hindus, a government that works for civilizational identity, is Hindutva. When the caste calculus breaks, there was a lot of discussion in this conference, that even the Dalits are voting for, even the Northeasterners are voting for BJP. Dalits are voting for, so they could not understand. And I've seen Prannoy Roy really flabbergasted on TV. He's like, oh my God, even these people, even this constituency, which is, so it's just amazing how a progressive, really progressive government that has modernized India has helped to break that caste calculus. And I think that is the next step, as Modi ji always keeps saying that, there are only 4 castes. I think most people would know that answer. He says these days, right? He says that there are only 4 castes: the women, the youth, the kisan, and the poor. He says these are the people who need to be uplifted to make India a powerful economy in 2047, and that is what we need to work towards. So hopefully there will be some changes, because we need to change this constitutionally to really get to dismantling and dissolving the caste consciousness that exists in our mind, the caste in our mind. I think my last slide is just for interest. So this is, before that, if you want any question answers, I can probably take them. But this is like, of course, as I said earlier, the Brahmins were like sort of meek observers in some ways, because a lot of their gurukuls obviously were dismantled. Their rosy roti was affected even during the Islamic times. So after that, so the poor Brahmin, in fact, is a reality. The Brahmins these days in the, like Rajat Mitra ji once pointed out to me, he said, it's like the rickshaw pullers in UP, they're all Brahmins. A lot of them are Brahmins, So there's no, in Pew Research, it showed that there is poverty is caste agnostic in India. There is no real like divide. A Brahmin, percentage of Brahmins poor is same as SC/ST poverty. So really egalitarian, I mean, the way our country has uplifted people in India is showing up, right, in how our country has built a bigger middle class, a bigger egalitarian system. Of course, like you said, there are always push and pull and dynamics, social dynamics. But we are looking at macro trends, and really caste is just the wrong word for us in conclusion. And caste hierarchy that existed during the British time is something that I have sort of developed, and I'm always welcome to feedback. But I looked at it based on the caste hierarchy in the railway system in Britain, in the British India. So railways were very, very hierarchical and colonial, right? So the British, the Babus, or the British Sahibs, when they used to sit, they used to have a very luxurious sort of carriage attached to the train, right? So the white colonials had the most like luxurious sort of lifestyle, and they also were obviously so I've used the railway as a metaphor as to how the hierarchy worked in India. The Parsis, by the way, Parsis are model citizens and all that, but in the British times, the Parsis were considered the Aryan race. They said, okay, these people have mixed and all that, but you are the real Aryans. So they gave them very high sort of rank everywhere. And if you have either been to Bombay, Gujarat, or, they have tracts and tracts of land that were just given away to the Parsis. Godrej and all these people. In Baroda, where my sasural is, the whole town almost was, all the clubs belongs to Parsis. All the stock exchanges, when India became free, if you've seen Dhirubhai Ambani's movie, he fights, the person he's fighting is a Parsi, because he refuses to let anyone else come in. But what I'm trying to say is that this was the hierarchy really that existed during that time. Parsis, then Anglo-Indians, they were biracial. So I've given a very racist term to each one of them, white, then Aryan race, which is, it just evolved on its own. The Anglo-Indians were sort of third, and Anglo-Indians were always bitter with the British people because they thought they were used and, abused. But they were still given a lot of privileges, easy access to migration to Britain, all that. Then, of course, the nobles and royals who acceded to the throne became important, the blue bloods, as I would call them. Then the brown sahibs, the colluders and collaborators who would leak information of freedom fighters, or who would simply help them, in some theories, like Aryan theory, they will write a paper or two, then they'll be given titles, and given awards. They had some award system, which I forget the name, but just briefly going through this. And then the martial races. So they identified, after the 1857 War of Independence, they identified people who did not be part of that war, and like the Sikhs and the the Gurkhas. So we think that, okay, the Gurkha and the Sikhs are, because they are the most, strong martial people. But the reason they were chosen is because they did not come fight against the British. And of course, there were other people who were included as part of the martial races, and rest who were considered not so martial. So they were again given their own, access to. So again, going to the train hierarchy, so they were allowed again to attach their carriages. The Brown Sahibs were allowed to have, there were first, second, third, and fourth class. And the martial races were allowed to have like wooden benches, and their train army compartments. And the cattle class were literally sitting on the floor with no support. That is why we see those Gandhi movie में जो scenes होते हैं सब, ऊपर चढ़ रहे, इधर चढ़ रहे, सब ऐसे ही बैठे हुए हैं. So there are no seats really. There were no seats. That is why that was called cattle class. जैसे ना गाय भैंस travel करती है. So that was how we were treated, And of course the criminal tribes and rebels, जो लोग हमारे जो the kings के जो the warriors थे जो उनको तो who would not accede to giving taxes because they had that spirit in them. So they were classified. One of my friends recently in US who passed away, he was from a Dalit community in Gujarat, Makwana. And they were, later when he passed away, I was just researching his community, what they are. And Makwanas were the warriors of Gujarat. So they refused to give up their land and they refused to give tax for it. So that's why they were labeled criminal tribes at that time. And they were hunted down and, treated as criminals. And so those were like the last in the caste hierarchy of India during the British time. So this was the real caste hierarchy. No Brahmins were really involved in anything. Indian and dogs are not allowed, and that included Brahmins. So it was like a really, really racist time that the British society that they created. And they made it unequal by giving wealth to the minorities of India and making sure the Hindus were always cattle class. So that is something, I think, this is just a small chart, but I think this needs to be elaborated a lot more. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to do that in some papers and research work. But yeah, I think I'll end here.
Even the word we use these days, thug.
Thug.
Thug is also one community which was there.
Yes.
Their name was, they were in the criminal tribes and rebels.
Very true. So
we use it till today.
And we still use it like a bad word, right? Like thuggy, हाँ. So that. बिल्कुल. Yes. So our ethnology needs to be explored, I think, from our own angle. Like, like you said about Sanskrit, also our ethnology needs to be studied. And so that's something I'm doing in a small way, like taking 5 of these SC/ST groups, Bhils and some, Ahirs, and developing some research on it from an Indic perspective, from our own ethnic leanings.